Welcome, everyone, to the Masculine Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez. I'm the founder and CEO of Epic Project. The Masculine Wilderness is a conversation about how men can show up in the world in the best versions of themselves. And I've said this over and over. I'll say it again today. We don't do that all by ourselves. We're fortunate. We're blessed to have women who are along on this journey with us. And today is just another example of that. Yasmin Vafa is the founder of Rights for Girls. She's a human rights attorney with a long pedigree in this work. And she is also the first Masculine Wilderness alum to come back and talk to us. And I asked her specifically today to come and spend some time with us and talk about a report that her organization has just published two weeks ago.
Yep.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago. And it is called Buyers Unmasked. Yasmin, can you give us kind of the high level overview of what this is? And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that we want to kind of dive into today. So can you give us a kind of an overview of the report?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much. It's a real honor to be asked back. So this report really came out of some of the other really great research that our partners have done on sex buyers, both here in the United States. You know, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women did some excellent research on sex buyers in New York State. And we have had some partners. Ellie Arrow, for example, has done great work on sex buyers in Europe, Germany, and elsewhere, for example. And what we wanted to do was to dispel with some of these myths around, sex buyers being innocuous, harmless, shy guys, who resort to prostitution because they, can't get a date, or, that they are just harmless, and that this is, in fact, a victimless crime. We have just heard from sex trade survivors, including child sex trafficking victims, for decades now, that buyers enact just as much violence, if not more, than traffickers and other exploiters. And so what we wanted to do was to showcase buyers in their own words and really have sex buyers speak for themselves, and to then analyze that information and propose some policy solutions to really address this issue. And so in Buyers Unmasked, we seek to do that. And we also seek to really talk about where we are as a nation today in terms of where young men and boys, as well as young people, are, and how these behaviors come to pass. I think a lot of people maybe assume that most men engage in sex buying. That's not true. Most men don't engage in this act, but those who do are high frequency buyers. They're the ones who are fueling the market. And so really, we just wanted to dispel with a lot of the myths and really expose sex buyers for who they are.
Yeah. Hearing you describe it the way you do, because it's just your style, it's very polite and professional. But when you say we want people to hear from sex buyers in their own words, that is a loaded statement, because the things they say, the things you've documented, I think to most people are at the very least shocking to hear the blatant disregard for just the integrity, the dignity of another human being. And you have pages and pages and pages of this. Epic was very proud to help support this effort with the data that we've accumulated over having these conversations for 11 years. And for people that don't know, Epic Project volunteers for over 11 years now have been having conversations with active sex buyers in the moment they're attempting to purchase sex. And so we've kind of got a front row seat to the thing that your report, our experience corroborates in a lot of ways what your report is advocating for and exposing, really. But it's, I do want to say this maybe by way of a little bit of a trigger warning. We're probably going to share some things and say some things in quoting active sex buyers today that might not be suitable for folks maybe sitting in the back seat of your car if you're listening to this while you're driving. So just a heads up on that. But we want to dive into this because, like you said, Yasmin, it's in their own words. It's the things that they have said about the women primarily, not exclusively, but primarily the women that they're attempting to purchase a sex act from that shine a really unique light into what this is really all about. Can you talk a little bit more? Let's start here. Like, there's a whole bunch of insights that you gleaned from doing this. Can you tell us how you collected the data, how you structured it, and then what are some of the high level insights that you think are maybe helpful and maybe some that are the most alarming to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing for folks to understand is that, these sex buyers who are habitual, purchasers, they talk to themselves on what are called review boards. And for those who, have never heard of these buyer review boards, for, lack of a better term, they're kind of functioning as like a Yelp for prostitution. So, these sex buyers go on these review boards. Some of them are paid, some of them are free, and they talk to each other and they essentially rate and review the individuals that they purchase for sex acts. Sometimes they, talk to each other about when a new batch of women becomes available. Sometimes they talk about and warn each other about if they have an exploiter, if they have a pimp, not because they're worried about the woman, but more
Right.
to warn each other about just be careful, and there might be a pimp nearby. And if there's law enforcement activity in a certain area, to evade law enforcement, and essentially just sometimes, complain about a certain quote unquote provider is what they call a lot of these women. And so what we did was go on these review boards and, take quotes, very recent quotes. You don't have to go very far. I just think, our team was not able to go much further than the first couple pages on a lot of these review boards. And so we took conversations from review boards and then from the Epic Project team. So the conversations, and we split them up into the hobby boards or review boards, as well as the market disruptors, which is what we called the conversations between the Epic volunteers and the individual sex buyers. And so between those two sets of conversations that the sex buyers had, we analyzed those conversations and drew some conclusions and summarized the different trends that we were able to decipher based on those conversations, and basically concluded that, ultimately sex buyers were very aware that in, many of these instances, the individuals that they were purchasing were, acutely vulnerable, in many cases subject to exploitation or trafficking, and that they essentially displayed in many instances overt misogyny, overt, racism and objectification. There were several conversations where they indicated awareness that the person was, dependent on drugs, that they were in an incredibly impoverished state. In many cases, the person there was a language barrier. They didn't even speak English. Several conversations specifically described a very young woman who was being purchased. Several conversations talked about law enforcement. Many displayed overt transphobia. One of the individuals described enacting violence on the person that they purchased. And so, we were able to conclude several different, trends among the conversations, all of which were incredibly disturbing.
Just to give you one example, and I'm just scrolling through the report, as you're sharing this. So here is one from a buyer in Rhode Island who, in his particular venue of choice, is Asian massage parlors, which we've talked about. I think we talked about it with you and previous guests, that this is a very, actually a growing venue for exploitation. And this is a quote on a hobby board by a buyer. He says, "I still go to AMPs, Asian massage parlors. Hell, I went today to 1021 and got my Mina, and had a very good massage with fairly cookie cutter AMP experience, but it's still scratching the itch because I do love a table shower massage and seeing a new supply of pretty Asian women at the ease of just deciding to walk in and have a good time whenever. It's always nice." So this is just I think it reveals the casual nature of and callous, I guess, of who these men are. I also want to point out, before we go much further, that this was your organization, Rights for Girls, is, I don't know if it's exclusively, but it's primarily staffed by women researchers and attorneys, and I know partners that you work with similarly. Some, who listen to this might be tempted to think, well, this is just, a bunch of angry feminist women,
Yeah.
man-hating. But I can speak for Epic as a contributor to this project. These are words that we have heard other men say. So it's there's not a lot of interpretation here, So I'm curious if they're, in this report, and there are dozens and dozens of these, but is there a comment to you that haunts you when you read it? Is there anything in particular?
I actually, there was one that, it was slightly older. So it didn't make it to one of the featured quotes that we pulled out. So I think it's in the appendix, but it struck me because, I just returned from New Mexico, from Santa Ana Pueblo, and we were doing a tribal judicial institute. And so, just being aware of the acute vulnerability of Native women, and the fact that most violence perpetuated against Native women is done by non-Native men. There's a sex buyer quote that gives advice to other sex buyers saying, if you're into Native women, I would recommend going to the casinos on the res and waiting close to when they're about to close, because the women there get really desperate when they lose all their money. And that's how I would recommend, if you're into Native women, wait till the end of the night when they lose all their money. And that's how you can basically go home with basically a desperate Native woman. And that really struck me. That one really stuck out to me as just the targeting and profiling of vulnerable Indigenous women, and to give that advice to others. Just that one really stuck out to me. I mean, there's ones that are much more vulgar. These are, ones that we can actually share. There are ones that are absolutely graphic, and and we didn't edit any of them. I should point out there's grammatical and spelling errors. We didn't edit any of them for content or spelling or grammar, but that one really stuck out to me, just the acute vulnerability of Native women, and to go to an Indian casino to target them specifically and to wait around. It was just really appalling.
There's a predatory kind of nature to that. And it also, it betrays that, the persistent myth that this is a victimless crime, that it's, right. It's a mutual transaction. This betrays all of that, because it's not. Right. If you're lurking behind a slot machine.
Yes.
Waiting
with your eye on particular women.
Yeah. And one eye on them and one eye on the clock. Right?
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's just, I'm looking through. So here's another one. This is Atlanta. And you did this geographically. You did it.
Yes.
The Northeast.
We did it by region. Yeah. So Northeast. Yeah. South, West Coast, Midwest.
West Coast. And
to capture, just to show that basically, East Coast misogyny is no different than West Coast misogyny.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that is interesting, because when I first saw the report, I thought, I wonder if there are differences, but it's pretty universal. Yeah. This guy in Atlanta said, I went to, it says Elk Healing, which is I'm assuming that would be a venue, to see a woman again last week, but she looked tired and provides me bad services. I complained to Mama, which would be the head of the Asian massage parlor. She showed me a new girl, young, and I went to see her today. Black, long hair, baby face, nice body, about 5'3" tall. I got good services, and we'll try again next week. And again, it's just it's consumer preference for another human being.
Right. And often based on race and ethnicity, right? They have a preference.
Yes. That came through loud and clear. They're very preferential.
Yes.
Yeah. This is one that kind of got to me. Let me see here. Find them, F them, forget them. And I'm abbreviating. This is the gold standard for men's spiritual health. This is the advice from one buyer on a board where they're evaluating, the relative value of the services they were provided for. You're a woman, when you read that, what does that do to you? I mean, I know you've seen worse, but how does that hit you?
Well, I mean, it's just the dehumanization, right? It's just, it's just they don't see these individuals as real people. I think that comes across very clearly, and the ones where it's very clear that there's an exploiter on the scene, there's just no regard. And it's consistent with what we've heard from survivors over the years. I've worked with so many survivors and they've said, I made up my mind. I'm thinking of this one young woman who said, I made up my mind that I was going to tell every sex buyer I encountered that I was there against my will. I was being trafficked. I had a trafficker and that I needed help and to please help me. And for 6 months, not a single sex buyer helped her. The top two reasons were that they had already paid and they didn't want to get in trouble. And it's consistent. And you see here, there's multiple quotes where they're saying, there's a guy in the car watching, or there's a guy, he's probably in the closet hiding, or a guy came home and was annoyed that, something was happening. And it's like just very clear that they are aware that there is, a third party exploiter and there's no regard for, is this woman okay?
Right. Right.
Well, should we call someone? It's just a warning to the other buyers, like, heads up, there's a trafficker here or a pimp here. Be careful.
I've had the same experience with our guys that are talking directly to active sex buyers. When I overheard a volunteer, I'm sure I've shared this story before on the podcast, but trying to talk to a buyer, saying the things, that we're talking about here, these are real human beings. And, do you not see this? And the response was literally, whatever, dude, I just want to get laid.
Yeah.
And that, the brutal clarity of that statement is the thing that's haunted me for years. It's like, that's what it boils down to. Want to share this. So this is a conversation with an EPIC volunteer. And this was from the Los Angeles area. So our volunteer is talking to a buyer, and he says, what makes you want to pay for sex? The buyer says, because I look at women as distractions. So I just use these services when I need to. And our volunteer said, distractions from what? The rest is to remain focused on what truly matters in life to me, my work, my family, my little world I live in. Like, the way he's able to compartmentalize that what he's doing and exploiting another person allows him to focus on the things that really matter. And I do not know who our EPIC volunteer is, but he's been well trained. He goes, I would argue that somebody else's life truly matters too. But when you're buying sex, the girl is treated like an object. And it just goes, the thread goes on, but he summarizes, and this is that whatever dude attitude. Yeah, she's an object that's placed there by society for men like us to use and then move on with life. And again, the callous disregard for the person on the other end of that.
Hey, Masculine Wilderness Podcast listeners, this is Lauren, your producer. If you found value in our show, we've got an epic opportunity for you. Become an epic ally today and join our fight against human trafficking. Your monthly support not only keeps this podcast going, but also fuels our mission to protect the vulnerable and combat exploitation. For less than one coffee a week, you can make a real difference. Head on over to epicproject.org and choose an amount that works for you. Even $13 a month can change lives. By becoming an Epic ally, you're not just supporting the podcast, you're joining a movement. Stand with us. Let's make an impact together. Thank you.
Because this report is, it's 2 weeks out now, I'm curious the kind of feedback you're getting from this information, or is it too early to tell yet how people are responding? Because you've been putting stuff out on social media.
Yeah.
Are you able to tell at this point what the response is from people in society or even in the anti-trafficking movement directly?
So it's been, we've gotten, I will say the biggest response I've gotten is from survivors and globally. So I've had a lot of survivors reach out from across the globe. One really stands out. She said, thank you for showcasing buyers. It's so critical to not only showcase their violent acts, but also their violent words, because I think that's a part of the abuse and the harm that survivors experience that's not always appreciated, and always showcased. So that was really meaningful. And, several other survivors have highlighted their appreciation for the work and this, being brought to light. And, the report also includes some policy recommendations that I think has been appreciated by folks in the advocacy space. I think, given what's happening across the country in terms of, legislation that is being introduced, both to advance survivor-centered reform, as well as, harmful legislation to fully decriminalize prostitution. This has been a helpful report. I know, for example, there's been legislation moving in places like Vermont, Washington State, New Hampshire, and elsewhere. So, this legislation will be very helpful. Illinois as well.
Yeah.
So, the report will be helpful to all of those efforts for sure. We've already heard that from advocates and survivors as well. But we've also seen survivor-led organizations using quotes from the report to advance the fact that buyers are violent and harmful. And, this is behavior that ought to be curbed.
Well, I like the way you describe it as violent words.
Yes.
And when I read through these, it's very un-Richard Gere-like in Pretty Women.
Yes.
In what ways? Because I think that's still a very persistent myth that this is that sex buyers are benign or benevolent and gentlemanly and all of that. Why is that myth so persistent in your opinion?
I think the Hollywood narrative, that glamorization, it's not just, Pretty Women. We talk about it in the report. We say, whether it's that classic fairy tale or, more recent movies like Poor Things or Honora, these films that really glamorize commercial sexual exploitation, whether it's through stripping or pornography, whether it's the media really seeking to normalize things like OnlyFans as, real opportunities for young people as if they're not violent and harmful. It's a real problem because they are not what they see. And there are just so many women and young women getting hurt on these platforms. And I think what we're not realizing is that the men who are seeking sex in many cases are violent. The things that are happening are not, this is a pattern. These are violent men. And in many cases, there have been research to indicate, there was a UCLA paper that came out that showed that sex buyers share characteristics of other sexually coercive men. And so, these aren't shy guys, despite the narratives that we see out there about, what about disabled men who need, these are not who are fueling the market. And, those arguments are made in bad faith. This is not, when you talk to survivors, that is not what's happening. And, we talk about the levels of violence. There was a Colorado study that showed that, prostituted people have a mortality rate that's 200 times, the average person. And so the levels of violence that they're experiencing, often at the hands of sex buyers, is just extreme. And we go into that. And not to mention the acute inequalities. We have a great graphic in the report that talks about the fact that sex trade survivors are overwhelmingly women and youth of color everywhere you look throughout the country, while sex buyers are overwhelmingly, men of means, and oftentimes white, middle-aged men of means. That doesn't mean every single sex buyer is a white man, but, in jurisdictions that have started to disaggregate their sex buyer data, they have found that overwhelmingly they tend to be very affluent white men. And when you look at the data, what we've presented, it's very jarring. And when you see that inequality and power differential, it's very impactful.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when I speak and talk to people about this issue, they want to know who these guys are. And this is kind of to your point that these are that power differential. These are men of means, even if it's moderate means, but they are men of means and influence in a community. So it's not necessarily the creepy guy in the trench coat out, across the street from the grade school. It's the guys you see when you go into Applebee's.
Right, exactly.
On a Tuesday night. It's kind of the everyman. And it strike me as you were describing this, I have friends, and I'm sure you do too. I have single friends, women, and some men too, but women who are on, dating apps. And it's frightening to think of the possibility, or would you say likelihood, that some of these same guys that we're capturing here are on those dating apps as well. I mean, it's just because it seems to be so prevalent. Would you agree with that?
I mean, it certainly could be. And I think that's why it's important to have some of these conversations around, healthy masculinity and consent and mutuality, and just being on the same page around some of these issues, and having these conversations early about pornography, and just understanding if you're on the same page about some of these issues early on, because it can really breed this type of behavior. And that's one of the concerns that we raise in the report, that especially American men reporting that they're very lonely, they don't really have many friends, and especially with Gen Z, 1 in 5 Gen Z boys reports admiring Andrew Tate, who's like a famous misogynist, proclaimed misogynist and alleged sex trafficker. That's very concerning. These conditions are exactly what breed this type of behavior. And so, the sooner we can really foster these types of and promote more, authentic relationships among, young men and boys, and also just healthy conversations around relationships and mutuality and equality, I think the more you can, prevent these types of behaviors from happening in the first place. And we've seen it, promoting these types of solutions, which we recommend in the report, have promoted and led to cultures of gender equality in nations that have adopted those policies.
So I want to talk about those recommendations, but before I do that, you on page 25 of the report, there's a table with a summarization of attitudes, because what you're talking about is, we're asking the question, what can we do to change the attitudes that are fostering this kind of violent and destructive behavior. And I'm just going to read just the summary of it and ask if you could maybe give a little more detail here. But across 89 conversations. Now, was that the EPIC data specifically that this is summarizing?
It was both the hobby boards and the EPIC data.
Okay, so across really the whole data set, 28 indicate awareness, you said this already, that the person being reviewed or purchased is acutely vulnerable. So it's the whatever dude, right? Mm-hmm. I just want to get laid. 28 express objectification and commodification of women purchased or solicited. So the reviews on the hobby boards, they say nothing about like I said, the dignity and value of the person. But 21 of these conversations display racism or fetishization. Can you describe, when you use that term, fetishization? Say it for me.
Fetishization.
I had it right the first time.
Yes.
What can you explain that? Is that the idea of wanting an indigenous?
Yes, exactly. So some of them would say, where can I get a voluptuous Latina? Okay. One of them says, I'm really into Russians and Kazakh girls. One of them was, describing the women and girls that he liked. And he said, I'm really looking for a Korean baby doll, so the ones that are just really looking for specific ethnicities and races, or I really like, or, I went for this one and you can tell she was hot because I never go for black girls, they're just very racist and singling out certain races and ethnicities very openly. And again, one of the points that we make in the report is, as a society, we don't accept any of this as a civilized society. So why do these guys get a pass? Yeah. Why do these guys get a pass? We don't accept racism, objectification, misogyny, hypersexualization of girls in a civilized society. So why do these guys get a pass? Why is this okay? Why do we normalize and accept sex buyers when they display all of these behaviors that are looked down upon in our society? This is not acceptable behavior by any stretch of the imagination. And we have survivors telling us it causes harm. So what are we doing here?
Is there usually, or maybe always, a connection between racism and fetishization?
Yeah. Yes. Because it is, and that's one of the things that people say about prostitution. It's just a job. Well, if it's just a job, why do they want such a specific racial and ethnic category for, do you care what race your waiter is? Do you care what, ethnicity of, or sex or gender is of the person who's performing, your, doing your hair? Like, it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. But these guys have a very specific fetish about, when they go to the massage or when they go to get, whatever. It's very specific, and it's highly racialized and gendered. Yeah. They're specific, and it's a sexual fantasy. They'll describe it in detail.
Yeah. Well, so just to go on through this table, because this picks up on that theme, 12 of these conversations indicate overt misogyny. And misogyny is, in a literal definition, is the hatred of women. It's some institutionalized, expression of that. 7 of these conversations specifically discuss young women. 6 signal awareness of coercion, including possible trafficking. Again, it's the whatever dude. 5 complain about safety measures undertaken by a prostituted person. Why would a buyer complain about that?
Honestly, no idea. It's mind-blowing to me. I do not understand why they would be complaining. But they were like, why are you doing this? She complained about, she insisted on a condom, like annoying.
And that's a complaint.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. 5 of these conversations discuss law enforcement, and some of the ones I've seen just suggest that they are aware that there's a risk of breaking the law here. 3 express transphobia. There was a couple there that were especially difficult to read. And 1 admitted enacting violence towards the prostituted person they purchased for sex acts. In your work with survivors, how common are these experiences of violence at the hands of buyers? Because I think one of the more persistent narratives is that pimps are bad, but not the buyers. Like, what do you hear from survivors about that?
I mean, I hear consistently that sex buyers enact just as much violence as exploiters. And in fact, we open the report with a quote from a survivor that says, there's not always a trafficker, but there is always a buyer. And I think that's a really important point for people to remember, because, in many instances, when, people are in desperate situations, they might be forced to, because of poverty, because of drug addiction, because of, many circumstances, they might be forced, to sell themselves. And so there might not be a third party exploiter in certain circumstances.
The exploitation itself is the
trafficker. Exactly. But there's always a sex buyer who's willing to take advantage of someone's desperation and vulnerability. And so it's important to realize that. But in the report, we talk about, a number of studies, one specifically that looks at 92% of women in the sex trade, talk about being subjected to rape, including being shot, strangled, burned, beaten, stabbed, or punched. And most of that was committed by sex buyers, but, again, trigger warning, but being urinated upon, defecated upon, ejaculated upon, forced to have unprotected sex, being subject to the insertion of foreign objects. We're talking about very serious and violent acts and degrading acts that cause long-term physical and psychological harm.
And yet some people would say, well, that's just all in a normal day's work, right? I mean, if this is legitimized and if it really is just a job, that doesn't that up.
Right. And we would say, like, what other job has these occupational hazards, right? If this was a job, you'd have to wear a full hazmat suit. I mean, what would be the OSHA requirements for a quote unquote job like this, right? So it's very serious. And I think the reality is, like, having abstract conversations about prostitution, you can say, like, people are being pearl clutching, but when you have conversations about prostitution that are reality based, like we're having right now, that's when you can be real about it and just be, honest about what people are actually subjected to, what sex buyers are really doing in these situations, and why, the physical and long-term trauma is so severe.
I know you to be a person that cares about outcomes and positive results. So what are the recommendations? What are the outcomes you're hoping for? You're hoping this work contributes towards?
Well, we know that there have been lots of pockets of innovation throughout the country, and we really wanted to highlight some of that great work. There have been some successes, like there have been some excellent work with sex buyers throughout the country. It's important to note, again, most men don't buy sex. I think the studies have it estimated somewhere around like 10%, maybe 15%. But that's still, millions of men who are causing a lot of harm. Some of the interventions that have been put into place have been very successful. So we highlight one of the best buyer accountability programs in the country that was headed up by Peter Qualitain, who's an expert on gender-based violence. And it was a team teaching approach. It was based in Seattle. He, being an expert on gender violence and domestic violence, partnered with survivors, and they would do this 10-week buyer accountability program whereby, if a sex buyer was convicted for soliciting sex from an adult, they would have to do this course. There was a, mandatory fine that went into finance victim services, and they would have to attend this course. And we outline, some of the elements of this course to show how it could be replicated. But they had some amazing results, and we list those results to show it can be done and attitudes can be changed if done effectively. It's not your typical quote unquote John school, like traffic school, where you sit there for a couple hours and get your record expunged. It was, very intensive, and the different sessions were based on things like, harm to victims, power and violence, vulnerability, mutuality, and relationships. And they ultimately had very, very successful outcomes. And so, in the report, we show the shifts in thinking as recorded by their exit surveys. And they had very, very good outcomes. And so I think being able to replicate programs like that, we also highlight some great examples in community accountability. For example, San Francisco PD has just instituted a program whereby, in high street prostitution areas, folks can submit photos of cars that are picking up, prostituted people and submit them on a website. And the Human Trafficking Task Force will review the material. And once they corroborate that the car was in fact, belonging to someone, they will send a letter home, not make an arrest. They will send a letter home to that person's house and say, here's a picture of your car. You were basically with a prostituted person. Here are the connections between prostitution and sex trafficking. Here's the harm that's being done to the person, to the community, potentially to you, to your family. And, it might have some awkward conversations at home, but removing that buyer anonymity is what they believe is enough to potentially curb the behavior. So again, not necessarily an arrest, but they're hoping just removing the buyer anonymity will be enough to curb the behavior. And then finally, we look at Cook County in Chicago, where the sheriff there, where the sheriff there actually worked really hard to try and repair the, very fraught relationship between sex trade survivors and the police. We're not going to pretend like survivors for years haven't told us that law enforcement have traditionally exploited them. Many of them are sex buyers. Many of them have, taken advantage of people in prostitution. And so there has been a very fraught relationship there where survivors don't trust, law enforcement or the criminal justice system. And so one of the steps towards seeking to repair that relationship and trust was the sheriff's office started to hire sex trade survivors. And so 3 survivors in the community were brought on and helped to advise the policies of that department. And so as a result, in 2017, they stopped arresting prostituted people. They used to do 250 arrests prior to 2017. They are now at 0 for prostituted people. And now they target the buyers exclusively. They get a $1,000 fine plus $500 to impound their car. That $1,500 goes to victim services. And again, buyer anonymity is removed. And the experts in that area say it's really chilled demand. And so again, we're hoping to give these examples. None of them are necessarily, legislative, but these demand reduction principles have an effect at, reducing not just sex buying, but also it's trafficking prevention, right? So people forget that buying sex is what fuels the demand that fuels sex trafficking. And so the more we can curb this behavior, the more we can prevent, the demand that fuels sex trafficking. And so those are some of the innovative examples. And then we give policy solutions as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you making that connection between when we talk about demand and prostitution and trafficking. Like that all intersects in the ecosystem we know as prostitution. And I don't think a lot of people like intuitively get that. I do want to say, and I'm proud to say this, but one of the 3 survivors, I believe in Chicago that was brought on by Sheriff Dart is Marian Hatcher. And she is, I will say it publicly, she is Epic Project's patron saint and elder. She's had a huge voice into what we do and why we do it. So I want to give a shout out to Marian. She's truly an elder. Yeah, there's so you're talking about outcomes. You talk about legislative recommendations. What could could these things are the legislative recommendations designed like for the state level, federal, or local, or is it really just could it be any level of application?
So, ideally, it's for the state level. So in the U.S., prostitution policy is governed by the states. So what we are ultimately proposing is, and what we discuss is that there's 2 kind of competing policy approaches that are being floated throughout the country right now. And that is full decriminalization, or what's more commonly known as decriminalizing sex work, which is a policy approach that not only decriminalizes the sale of sex, but also decriminalizes acts of pimping, purchasing sex, and brothels. The concern about that approach and what we talk about through and show through case studies in the report is that by repealing all aspects of the sex trade, it increases sex trafficking, mainly because by decriminalizing sex buying, we invite more men to the market as new clients, which spikes the demand even harder and higher than currently exists.
And there's precedent around the world for that.
Exactly.
Pattern.
And so we use the case studies of Australia, New Zealand, and Rhode Island. A lot of people don't know Rhode Island essentially had a period of full decriminalization of indoor prostitution for 29 years, from 1980 to 2009. And because it was such a disastrous impact, they reverted their laws back to strict prohibition in 2009. In fact, we talk about they passed more laws to prohibit, human trafficking because of the effects. So again, if it was such a beneficial policy, why would Rhode Island have ended it and passed more stringent laws to deal with the aftermath in 2009? And so instead, we offer what we're calling the survivor model. It's also known as, the Nordic model, the abolitionist model, the equality model, and it is effectively a partial decriminalization approach. So what it would do is decriminalize the acts of selling sex, offer services and support to prostituted people to help them exit the industry if they so choose, and clear and expunge their criminal records that are associated with prostitution convictions. But it would maintain all of those criminal penalties and prohibitions against pimping, sex buying, and brothels to keep the industry in check. And as opposed to full decrim, instead of expanding the industry, it essentially shrinks the industry. And so we use examples of, the countries that have implemented this approach, where there's much more of them, and we list them in the report. Sweden, Norway, Iceland are the first 3 countries to implement it. They also have the highest levels of gender equality in the world, but also France, Canada, Ireland, Northern Ireland. There's many jurisdictions that have implemented it, and most recently, the state of Maine. And so we're hoping that paves the way for jurisdictions here in the U.S. And in fact, last Friday, Illinois introduced a survivor model bill. Wow. So there's precedent for it here, and we're hoping it kind of takes off.
Yeah, that's so good. So, you and I are both deep in the weeds on this issue. We interact a lot in policy conversations, but I also know that there's, like you said, there's a small minority of men that are really driving this business, which means that there's a larger majority of men who they're not actively involved in this, but they could become really potent allies. And that's always where our focus is with Epic. So what would be your advice to men who might not read a detailed report, but like how can we build more allies? What's needed to get more men involved? They don't necessarily have to go and testify at a hearing, but what could be done to motivate and engage more men in this effort?
I mean, I just think we're at a really crucial tipping point as a nation right now in general. I think, we just kind of have to decide like where we are going to go from here, in terms of kind of where we want to be in terms of women and girls' rights and gender equality. And, do we want to push forward in terms of progress and in terms of, valuing the dignity and worth of, every person? Or do we want to kind of continue pushing forth with this, men's rights agenda? And I think it's just very important to bring everyone together. And I think, everyone really benefits from ultimate equality. And I think, one of the things that I think was incredibly powerful this past several months was witnessing the trial in France of Giselle Pellicot, the woman in her 70s who experienced just a brutal and, horrifying rape at the hands of her husband, who elicited, dozens of men, I think more than 50 men, to basically rape his wife over the course of their marriage. And I think it was just very powerful to witness her courage in dealing with that tragedy and betrayal. But one of the things that she said that was incredibly powerful and moving was that she chose to deal with it publicly, to expose all of those perpetrators, because she felt very strongly that shame must change sides.
Yeah.
And we really need everyone's buy-in for a cultural change that big. Mm-hmm. And I think, decades ago, we experienced this same shift on domestic violence. It used to very much be seen as a personal matter, a private family matter. We used to tell men to, when police would respond, to take a walk around the block. And I think, it's very similar with prostitution now. And I think we really need a more cultural buy-in around this issue. And I think, again, most men don't do this. And I think it's really time for everyone to stand up and really be more vocal about the fact that this isn't socially acceptable behavior, that, it isn't something that we want young men and boys and, young people to engage in. And this isn't, these attitudes that are displayed and on, are not compatible with what we think is acceptable in our culture. And I just think, we need to be more vocal about it, because it really does impact society at large. It really does impact other young people, especially young women and girls of color, but really other women and girls, right? If you could put a price tag, and people say this in countries where legalization has happened, in Nevada, certainly, any woman or girl has a price tag on them, it really makes it so that, all of us are less equal. And so I think it's very important for male allies to speak up and to promote more opportunities for young people to engage and have opportunities to be involved in groups and support, and other than just this like online manosphere where I think it's very harmful and it fuels this type of antisocial kind of harmful behavior.
I feel very, I think, simultaneously encouraged and convicted to hear you, as someone that I respect as a leader in this work, to say men have to speak up. I think a lot of times for men, it's hard to know what to say. It's hard to get the courage to say something. But I will say what you've done, what Rights for Girls have done with this report, is it has given us something to talk about and given us something, I think, that can create some traction in conversations. I want to thank you for leading in this and for your leadership, and pretty sure we'll talk again. But for now, Yasmin Vafa, Rights for Girls, thank you. The report is on your website, right?
Yes, you can access it on the homepage. But you can also just go to rightsforgirls.org/Buyers Unmasked.
And I would also encourage you, we're going to be posting more information about it on our social media, but follow Rights for Girls as well. And you're going to see more and more of this going forward. Thanks, Yasmin.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.